Think back to all the best films of the 2010s list that you were seeing just a few years ago, and try to remember some of those titles that frequently came up. Moonlight, Parasite, Mad Max Fury Road, Get Out, The Tree of Life, The Social Network. One film you won't find on pretty much any of these lists is Hu Bo's 2018 masterpiece, An Elephant Sitting Still. The film has been incredibly well received by those who've watched it, but for a handful of reasons that number of praising voices has never been nearly as vast as it has been for those other films. An Elephant Sitting Still is, frankly, one of the hardest films one can recommend, but I think it's also one of the most necessary. Epic and intimate in equal measure, the film gained immediate recognition not only for the tragic backstory that accompanied it, but also how the remnants of that tragedy seeped into the fabric of the film. To say some movies aren't for everyone is probably the understatement of the century when it comes to An Elephant Sitting Still. But for anyone willing to venture out there, the potentially life-changing journey is well worth the effort. Before getting into the meat of what makes An Elephant Sitting Still such an important film, allow me to put my 2 wasted years of marketing classes to some good use and try to sell you on the film based on its plot. Hu Bo tells the story of 4 distinct characters in China's Hebei province. An alienated, impoverished teenage boy who confronts his bully. A teenage girl getting cozy with her vice principal. An elderly man being forced out of his home by his family. A small-time gangster having an affair with his best friend's wife. Over the course of a single day, these 4 aimless stories interact at various points. All the while, a fascination takes hold towards a mythical circus elephant in the northernmost province of Manzhuli, which sits patiently all day as the abuses of the modern world pass it by.
他他妈就一直坐那儿，我操！
好玩吗?
Right off the bat, you can already tell why this is a tough sell for most people. An Elephant Sitting Still is, by nature, a pretty dour film, consumed by gray skies, 0 smiles, and a grand total of 1 joke about a man drowning. In this day and age, most people would be forgiven for not wanting to put themselves through the ringer like that, but there's a real power to Hu Bo's dark vision that serves the film's greater meaning about our malaise towards the modern world. On the surface, you can attribute An Elephant Sitting Still's sad atmosphere specifically to its Chinese setting, and there's a clear argument to be made there. The film doesn't take direct shots at communism, hence why it didn't get the Zhang Yimou treatment of government censorship, but the hints of economic turmoil are planted throughout. The low-standing school is going to be torn down with no concern for where its students will end up. Wei Bu is bullied because his mom sells second-hand clothes, and his dad lost his job for accepting bribes. Wang Jin is forced out of his already decrepit home because his son wants to send his daughter to a better school where she'll be qualified to work a high-paying job. The specificities tying the film's world weariness directly to its home country are unmistakable, but as our global social and economic situations continue to spiral in undesired directions, you can't help but find your own points of reference in the film's dreary tone. Hu Bo was a student of legendary Hungarian filmmaker Béla Tarr, literally having been the director's protege, and the influence of his work on Hu's visual style is unmistakable. The film is composed almost entirely of these floating long takes, constantly hovering in close-ups with a shallow focus lens blurring out the background. As these characters look solemnly off-screen, at a world out of focus, the directionless existence of a life drowned in the cynicism of earlier generations begins to rub off on the viewer. It would be tough to call this a pleasant viewing experience for anyone not named Mikhail Haneke, but the raw authority of Hu Bo's guiding hand is undoubtedly effective and thought-provoking across every minute of the runtime. And speaking of which, if the general tone of An Elephant Sitting Still didn't paint a clear enough picture of why this film is tough to recommend, then maybe you'll be swayed against it by the fact that the movie is just under 4 hours long. Now, I made a brief case for this film specifically in my video on cinematic Stockholm Syndrome, but even I, a person who sat through countless hours of filmic nihilism, can't begrudge anyone for having difficulty in watching a movie that sounds this grim, especially over the amount of time needed to watch 8 episodes of The Office or spend 1 trip at the DMV. Regardless, the case I made for the film still stands, and An Elephant Sitting Still is maybe the only movie of over 3 hours in length where every single minute of that runtime feels fully earned. That's an impressive feat on its own, before you even account for how much of the runtime is spent in silent reflection, absorbing the film's pessimistic environment. Now, what makes Hu Bo's film feel fully earned in its generous length is the fact that these breathy moments never feel overly indulgent. Unlike his mentor, who would make a 7.5-hour film including real-time scenes of characters walking silently across an entire village, Hubo knew when the time came for silence and when the time came for muttered grievances. Now to be fair, these directors' goals aren't entirely the same anyway, and as a wise user on Letterboxd once said, it's essentially a difference between pessimism and nihilism. And I think that difference is the key to what makes this film feel so necessary. Over the course of these 4 hours, Hubo surrounds us with so much despair that it's easy to regress to a point where we feel like nothing matters. As these characters slowly find some sense of purpose, even in the journey towards an abused circus act that might not even exist, we're reminded that the world is, as the film's tagline suggests, a wasteland. But with a little direction, maybe we can begin our voyage towards some solace in this beaten-up place we call home. All this is to say that An Elephant Sitting Still is, for many an eager filmgoer, an impossible mountain to climb. It's a film in which anger, confusion, and hopelessness all converge to pose the question, what's the point? Given Hubo's own tragic course of life, it's difficult to shake the sense that this film is driving home a relentless sense of hopelessness. What Hubo shows us, though, is that maybe this wasteland can still derive some meaning if we face it together. The titular elephant that watches the world go by, taking in all the abuse thrown its way, is much like our collective generation, powering through what often feels like a fruitless life thanks to the solace we find in each other. I've seen An Elephant Sitting Still 3 times over the last 3 years, and every time I do, there's a certain catharsis that comes from experiencing this level of dread and letting that experience wash over me all the way to its emotional conclusion. In a way, watching An Elephant Sitting Still every year, right before the new year begins, is like letting all the built-up poison of the past 365 days just seep out, leaving room to experience whatever life has in store until the next time. Clearly, this film was a personal endeavor for the director, who was uncompromising with his producers in maintaining his 4-hour vision exactly as he saw fit. While creating a film about the journey through a hopeless world, eventually the toll of facing his personal demons was too great, and on October 12, 2017, after An Elephant Sitting Still had wrapped production, Hubo took his own life. He was 29 years old. It's uncomfortable and arguably insensitive to try and frame An Elephant Sitting Still through the lens of Hubo's passing. All we can say on that front is that this story was one he wanted to tell. He fought tooth and nail to see it through, and the world is a much richer place artistically with this masterpiece in it. The world will never know how much life-changing cinema it lost with the tragic passing of Hubo, but all we can do now is take the one film he did complete, and honor An Elephant Sitting Still for its power to charge our emotions and help us cope with the hardest parts of life, so that we can find and appreciate its moments of purpose in humanity together.